All right, in this brief set of slides, we are going to talk about the targets and the methods of influence for interest group activity. All right, and so in that sense, what I mean is we're going to talk about the legislative branch as a target. Primarily, we're going to talk about the U.S. Congress, although this would also apply to the Nevada legislature. We're going to talk, and that's the quintessential form, right, of interest group politics. When one thinks about it, right, one typically thinks about lobbying Congress. We're also going to talk about, however, right, the targeting of the executive branch, the federal bureaucracy, but also, right, the state bureaucracy here in Nevada. A lot of people don't realize that. I'm like, wow, you should, man, because that's really important, right? It turns out federal bureaucrats, state bureaucrats, they make a lot of critical policy decisions, right? Critical decisions about how to carry out laws and so forth, what regulations to have, what regulations not to have. Man, there's a lot going on there in executive branch agencies. And if you're an interest group of any size or significance, you're going to want to definitely be targeting the bureaucracy. Uh, and then finally, right, the courts as a target of interest group influence. And right, the rules of the game there are going to be different than they are for the Congress, different than they are for the executive branch, but there's also some overlap. But yeah, for sure, if you're an interest group in American politics, you're definitely going to want to take into account a legal strategy for advancing your group's interests. And it's going to depend a little bit, right? Are you dealing with the federal courts? Right? There are ways you can, in a sense, broadly understood, lobby the federal courts. And then, right, state courts, because they operate differently than federal courts, right? Typically elected, like here in Nevada. Now, the rules of the game for targeting state courts are going to be a little different than the rules of the game for targeting federal courts. All right, now, when interest groups are looking to exert influence over government, what are their specific targets? One is the obvious one, right? Legislative bodies, be that Congress or the Nevada legislature, maybe Las Vegas City Council, maybe the Clark County Commission, because these legislative bodies, right, are making important decisions that affect various individuals and various groups in ways that are quite significant. So, if we're talking about the inside game of lobbying, how do interest groups exert influence via the so-called inside game? They work directly with members of, in this case, the legislature. Now, you don't just target anybody, right? If you're talking about the U.S. Congress as a target, and let's say that you are Cargill and you are a big agribusiness and you want to define organic as broadly as possible so that you can market your products as organic as a way to enhance your profit, who are you going to focus on in Congress, right? Not just anybody. A couple of different foci here. You want to focus on members of the Senate Agricultural Committee, right? Because they're making a lot of this agricultural policy. They specialize in that. The House Agricultural Committee, you want to make sure you connect with those people. You want to connect probably with Senate leadership. So right now that would be Mitch McConnell, that would be Harry Reid. You also want to connect with House leadership. That would be people like John Boehner and Nancy Pelosi. So you target very selectively here those members of Congress that are most important to what you're interested in. How do you exert this influence? Part of it is you're providing information to these individuals, right? You specialize in your area. You've collected a lot of data, albeit your approach might be a little on the bias side. Nevertheless, you've collected a lot of data. You've crunched the numbers. You've come up with some interesting information, some interesting analysis. Legislative bodies are always interested in that. So part of the coin of the realm would be information that's germane to their particular area of policymaking. But realistically, it's also about money. No surprise there, right? Campaign contributions flow to the targets in question, right? It's a way to gain access. It's not a direct quid pro quo, I suppose, but it's certainly a way to gain access. Members of Congress have scarce time. Who gets access to their scarce time? On average, generally speaking, those interest groups that contribute the most in terms of campaign contributions. That becomes crucial, right? And then a third method of influence, I think, would be the revolving door, right? Where do many members of Congress end up after they leave Congress, voluntarily or involuntarily? They end up becoming lobbyists. They end up working in the industries that previously they had made policy for. So does that make legislators more willing to cooperate with moneyed interest groups in the hopes that they might have employment down the line, working with them in one way or another? Absolutely, right? No question about it. Uh, and we've put in place some limits on how quickly you can go into lobbying once you leave Congress. It's a year, I think, maybe two now. But a lot of them just start working right away. They're not registered as lobbyists, but they effectively lobby. And then when they can, they register as lobbyists. So there's a lot of ways around some of those ethical rules that really don't do much to limit this avenue of influence. So uh, no question about that. This is how the game is played in Washington. The coin of the realm would be you provide information to members of Congress, you provide campaign contributions, you provide possible employment down the road, all designed to secure access and influence within the halls of Congress. And it can get pretty intense, people, let me tell you. There are often cases where interest groups will draft legislation that affects them. And they'll draft the language and they'll hand it over to a member of Congress who then will insert that language, sometimes word for word, directly into a law. Their influence can be quite substantial. And not just anybody gets to do that, it's the big guys there on Capitol Hill. So it is what it is, right? And again, these are some of Schachtschneider's concerns, that money talks. Okay. Something else I wanted to mention here, but I'm blanking out on it a little bit. Staffers. A lot of people don't realize staffers. If you're the chief of staff for Harry Reid, chief of staff for Mitch McConnell, you have a lot of influence. Look, FaceTime with Harry Reid, FaceTime with John Boehner, FaceTime with Mitch McConnell, very hard to secure, even for the big guys. But often, who do they want access to on a more regular basis? Chief of staff, right? The top staffers for these members of Congress who make a lot of these decisions and recommendations to their boss, what language to include, what language not to include. So you often are trying to get access to these really low profile people who work for the senator or the member of Congress. These are also the same people who often end up working in industry once they leave government service. And so they become a very juicy target for a lot of interest groups, right? Okay, so I wanted to mention that. All right, so these are some of the ways in which interest groups play the so-called inside game of lobbying members of legislative bodies. Another target for interest group activity: bureaucrats, right? The bureaucracy, the executive branch bureaucracy. Not just any bureaucrat, right? Not rank and file. The political appointees much closer to the top, right? So the Secretary of Ag, some of his or her top lieutenants, Secretary of Defense, some of their top lieutenants, their leadership team, head of the Department of Homeland Security, head of the Department of Education, and some of their leadership team, the EPA. You get the idea. The big guns within the bureaucracy, the ones making a lot of the policy decisions. Right, because that's something crucial here, right? Why do lobbyists target bureaucrats? Because bureaucrats make policy. They translate what is often a broad mandate from Congress into very specific regulations. Congress says, get the air clean. The EPA decides, this is how we're going to do it. These are the standards we're going to set. These are the levels of pollution that are acceptable. These are the levels that are not acceptable. So in that sense, right, they are making policy. It's like Congress writes a few broad sentences. The bureaucrats fill in all of the many details, right? And so policy is being made in crucial ways that have a big impact on the energy industry, the agricultural industry, the education industry, all of these areas of business activity in America. And so indeed, lobbyists have a strong vested interest in making sure that they influence in some way what regulations are being established by top-level bureaucrats. What do they do here to secure that influence, right? They provide information. Bureaucrats, like members of Congress, are hungry for information. Obviously, this information is going to be a little bit skewed in the interest of the interest group in question, but nevertheless, right, these interest groups are specialized, are expert in their areas. The bureaucracy wants to hear that. They want to learn about this information, look at the analysis, and so on. What else can interest groups do to secure influence beyond information? Sponsor conferences in exotic locales, right, as a way to curry favor with top-level bureaucrats. Come learn about carbon dioxide emissions. Let's learn about it in Hawaii. Let's learn about it in Las Vegas or what have you, right? So they do that as a way to secure some influence, right? And then finally, provide employment to top bureaucrats once these top bureaucrats leave government service. Again, these are only for the top guns within the bureaucracy, not just anybody. But if you play your cards right as a bureaucrat, if you establish good working relationships with powerful interest groups by doing largely what they tell you to do, your chances of getting employment with them later on are much better. If you're a pain in the ass, if you're adversarial, if you're hard on these industries, your likelihood of employment becomes much lower. So you can see where the incentives are here. The revolving door is a significant avenue of influence for interest groups working within the bureaucracy. Finally, another target for interest groups are going to be the courts, right? And if we're talking about the federal courts in particular, which would be the U.S. Supreme Court, most importantly, the U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeal, and the U.S. District Trial Courts. How do you influence these bodies? You can't lobby them in quite the same way that you might lobby Congress. You cannot lobby them in quite the same way that you might lobby the bureaucracy, but there are specific ways to do this, right, that are kosher, legal, and legitimate. Sponsored test cases. This is what the NAACP did in Brown v. Board of Education circa 1954, right? The NAACP found a likely plaintiff, I think it was Linda Brown, a young black girl who had to walk past a white school, walk another mile or more to get to an all-black school. Her parents wanted to file suit, did not have the money to hire legal counsel. The NAACP stepped in and said, hey, you know what? We think you would be a great plaintiff. We want to pursue a policy change. We want to reverse Plessy v. Ferguson. We want a new reading of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. We think you're just the person. So that's what interest groups can do, right? They can find a likely plaintiff, sponsor that plaintiff, provide legal counsel, handle all of the expenses, and try to reach the Supreme Court if they are damned lucky. You see that in Brown v. Board of Education. That's one way to influence the courts, right? Because the courts also make policy. Just like in some ways, Congress and the bureaucracy, the courts also make policy. They issue decisions that have long-term consequences across a range of situations, such as Brown v. Board of Education, right? That didn't just vindicate the interests of Linda Brown. It vindicated the interests of all Americans in no longer permitting state-sponsored, racially segregated public schools, K through 12. Influence also via amicus curiae briefs. That's what you do if you're an interest group and you don't have a ton of money. You can only sponsor so many cases. That's very expensive. Amicus curiae briefs are a cheaper way to go about this. That's when you're not one of the two parties to a case, but you are interested in the outcome. And so you would submit to the court for their consideration a legal brief saying, hey, we're not the plaintiff, we're not the defendant, but we do have a stake in the outcome. We believe these are the issues, and we believe this is how you should decide them. So I'd have to look at it more closely, but I suspect there were probably some additional civil rights organizations that may have filed amicus curiae briefs in the case of Brown v. Board of Education, right? Because if you are, let's say, I don't know, let's say that you are the Congress on Racial Equality, right? So you're also interested in civil rights. You don't have the money to sponsor a case, but you would like to see Brown v. Board decided in a particular way, right? So you can file arguments and say, hey, look, we think this is about the 14th Amendment. We think it's about the Equal Protection Clause. We think you should overturn Plessy v. Ferguson. The court doesn't have to accept these briefs, but they typically do, as long as it's a legitimate group with a legitimate stake in the outcome. So you can also do that. It's not as influential as sponsoring a case. The court may not accept your brief. They may not give it much weight, but sometimes they do. So it's usually worth a go, and it's not that expensive. Finally, at the federal level, Interest groups can also influence the federal bench via lobbying the Senate on those who are being nominated to the Supreme Court, the circuit courts of appeal, the federal trial courts. Right? Because these people are nominated by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. If the Senate denies consent, that person will not serve on the federal bench. So that's where interest groups, right, can influence the process. They can influence who ends up on the bench. Who nearly ended up on the Supreme Court? Robert Bork back in the day, nominated by President Ronald Reagan. Liberal groups, however, I think like the NOW, like the ACLU, they lobbied vigorously against Bork's confirmation, and ultimately the Senate was convinced. Enough of the Senate was convinced that Bork was not a good, strong nominee to the Supreme Court. And so liberal groups managed to get him what's called now borked. I've been borked! It means you've been shot down, arguably sometimes using somewhat low techniques, perhaps, smeared a little bit. I've been borked. So Bork got borked, and now he's in the dictionary. He would have preferred to be on the bench. Because who ended up serving on the bench instead? Who was nominated after he was defeated by these interest groups? Anthony Kennedy. If Bork had ended up there instead of Kennedy, I think Bork is now deceased. But let's say that he was still alive and he was there for the same-sex marriage case, right? He would have gone the other way. That case would have turned out differently. So that's how important it can be for an interest group, in this case, to defeat a nominee. They reshaped policy on same-sex marriage down the road. So there you have it. That's another great way to influence what the courts do, influence the membership of the courts. It's difficult to defeat a nominee, but it can happen. And then finally, if you're trying to influence Nevada courts, like the Nevada Supreme Court, and now the Nevada Court of Appeals, how can you do that? In some of the ways that we've suggested here. Certainly the first two, right? You can sponsor a test case, perhaps. You can file an amicus curiae brief. You cannot lobby the Senate, because that's not how things work in Nevada, right? But what can you do? What do we have here for the Nevada Supreme Court and now the Court of Appeals? 6-year terms, initially gubernatorial appointment for that Court of Appeals, but after that, elections, right? So these are going to be elected positions. These are elected positions for the Nevada Supreme Court. These state and local trial courts are also elected. How can you influence these elections? Campaign contributions. Which groups make the most contributions to these judicial elections? Law firms and businesses. Not surprising, right? Because they want to influence who's on the court and thereby influence what the courts decide. And that's what Sandra Day O'Connor has argued, right? This is not good. It's justice for sale. So many believe that this is why we need publicly financed judicial elections. But we don't have that. They are privately financed. It raises ethical questions. Is justice for sale in those many, many states where you have judicial elections at the state and local level, arguably. All right, what are some additional strategies that interest groups might use to influence our politics? One is a strategy of going directly to we the people, right? Go directly to the public, educate the public in favor of your group and or your group's policy objectives. Right, because, and we talked about this when we talked about social movements a little bit much earlier in the course, if an interest group, right, can shape public opinion, then, right, they can indirectly influence legislative bodies, executive bodies, and really even judicial bodies. I can remember back in the day when I was but a young lad, the NRA was arguing repeatedly in like newspaper editorials and articles and so forth that the Second Amendment should be understood, the right to keep and bear arms, as a universal right applicable to we the people. Because for almost our entire history as a country, the courts had ruled, when they ruled on it at all, that the Second Amendment only protected members of well-regulated state militias, right? Which doesn't cover very many people at all. Right? So they had this ad campaign to convince we the people that that was the incorrect reading of the Second Amendment. And at the time, I remember dismissing it as, that's crazy talk. People are never going to buy that argument. It's crazy talk. Wow, who got the last laugh, man? The NRA got the last laugh. I think they did a great job of convincing we the people that that was the correct reading of the Second Amendment. And then that filtered down, right, to legislative bodies, federal and state. It filtered down to the courts that ultimately adopted that argument, right, back in 2008 for the first time, and executive branch agencies. Right? It was super successful. It was a long-term public education approach that was very successful. And then our book also talks about, right, and it clearly overlaps. They put it in a separate section, not sure why. Mass media campaigns, right? Mass media campaigns. Again, going directly to we the people through mass media. Although they do point out that with mass media, right, that can be very expensive and not available to all groups. Harkening back, right, to E.E. Schatzschneider's argument that not all groups are created equal. Some are more equal than others. And then our book delineates 3 different forms of mass media campaigns that interest groups might sponsor. A goodwill campaign, right, to convince we the people that your industry, your group, they're the good guys, right? Casinos, I see that all the time right here in Las Vegas. The casinos will run these ad campaigns in which they say, look, if you're a problem gambler, if you're addicted to gambling, we want to help, right? Here's your outreach number that you can call. Here's a contact, right, that you can reach out to. These are the groups you can join that will help you with your gambling problem. Right? They're trying to convince we the people that casinos are engaged in, right? I mean, something that has the whiff of being a little sketchy, gambling. That's why they call it gaming, by the way, not gambling. It's got that whiff, right, of impropriety, but they're saying, no, we do this in a positive way. We don't want problem gamblers throwing their money at us. Well, they kind of maybe sort of do, right? But they want to convince people that they have a good faith commitment to addressing individuals with gambling problems. It's a goodwill campaign, right? It generates a sense of goodwill towards the casino industry. I see that also here in Nevada with the mining industry up north. They now have, what is it, Barrick Mining, one of the big ones up north. They have an office now here in Henderson, here in the valley. And their job really, right, is to sponsor things like the Smith Center and other public projects like public education, right, to convince people that the mining industry, they're the good guys, right? They're the good guys. They're doing good work here in the valley. You also get what are called offensive campaigns to persuade the public to support a policy objective. And let's just speak hypothetically here. Let's say the AARP, which we've talked about. Let's say that the AARP runs a series of ads promoting reforms to Social Security, whatever those reforms might be. All right? Because AARP is going to argue, look, we need to reform Social Security now because it's running into fiscal problems that are going to start to mean a cut in benefits in the next 10, 15, 20 years, right? So let's get out ahead of that problem, and then let's get some reforms taken care of here that will make Social Security fiscally viable on into the foreseeable future. Right? These are specific reforms that we're advocating, whatever those might be, to shore up the program in the future. And then defensive campaigns, right? Going directly to we the people through a mass media campaign to convince the public to not support certain policies. Great example here, right? The NRA running ads saying we don't need federal or state bans on assault-style firearms, right? And then they'll make all the arguments that they're going to make against these policies. Because that's become increasingly popular, especially at the state level. Right? Maybe we should ban certain forms of assault-style weapons. We have in the past. Those expired a long time ago. But we had those regulations in the past. Maybe it's time to revisit them in the age of mass shootings. And the NRA's argument, right, is going to be no. Let's not do that. Let's defend against those policies. Let's discourage them.